There are some programs, like I know public charter programs, that are required to give a grade, but even then, there's things we can do to diminish that. And so at the adolescent level, everything we do, all of our assessment, it's authentic assessment. So it's real work that they're doing across the environment. And that's how we as guides look and say, okay, what kinds of things are the students doing? What skills are they demonstrating? What concepts do they seem to be understanding through that work? Students are writing advertisements for their microeconomy funds, or they're writing a paper based on something that they were really interested in seminar and they want to explore it further. Those are the kinds of things that we're looking for that come out of the students' interests.
However, when we have students from the mixed age groups in Montessori, you have at least 3 age groups, 3, 4, or 5-year-olds in the same classroom. There is just something amazing that happens, and you've seen this in middle school. Can you speak to what happens when you have the mixed age groups in the same classroom?
Yeah, well, it's just beautiful because the culture creates and recreates itself. And so in a traditional classroom, when you have one grade band a year, everything has to be remade every single year, start from zero. In a Montessori classroom with a 3-year cycle with mixed age groups, the older students take the lead as the culture creators and as the culture preservers. And so they are the ones who invite and initiate the younger students not only into the ways of being, of how do we interact in this space, but what are the systems that keep the classroom running? What are the types of independence that we expect you to have? How can we help you get there? And it really develops a strong sense of mentorship and a really strong connection. And it's something that I recall as being a stark difference from my experience when I went from my Montessori program to a traditional prep school program as a young person. Because when I was in upper elementary, I was friends with students in, 4th grade who were in my class and 5th grade who were in my class, but also with folks in lower elementary who were in 3rd grade and 2nd grade. And there was no reason why we wouldn't be friends. No reason why someone who's younger than me, or for them, someone who's older than them, might not be a close friend. And then I went to my New England prep school where, of course, we were based off of grade, and all the other 7th graders were saying, oh my gosh, do not go hang out with those 6th graders. They are so young and odd. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't know why they see it that way. Like, that is just totally not my experience at all. And it creates for the environment and for the guide that ability to step back, to let that culture build, for the students to really build those strong relationships that if you're siloed off into your particular grade band, you don't get that experience. And in fact, what you often see is othering of students in other grades and a retreat from community, whereas in Montessori, students step into community because they feel it as a responsibility that they're really glad to have.
Yeah, what a great sense of belonging, right? For 3 years, you're with your almost siblings and friends in the classroom, and you look forward to learning and growing with them. Many skills, including leadership, takes place there, sometimes being led and sometimes you lead others. Now, homework can be a big thing for parents. Homework, and tests, grades. What are grades and testing like in a Montessori environment, or are there not any?
Well, that's a great question. First, I want to just dispel the idea that grades give any sort of picture of what a child is capable of doing. Grades and standardized exams, they don't. A grade is an absolutely subjective measure that is different from class to class, school to school, and brings the conversation away from the child and their abilities. The same thing with a standardized test. A standardized test tests how well a student can play the game of that particular exam on that particular day in that particular moment. It does not really in any way demonstrate what they know, the depth of their knowledge, et cetera. And so, I have seen schools that I've worked in and schools that I've worked with grapple with this in different ways. I think that as Montessorians, we have to do our job to keep the pressure of grades and tests away from students as much as possible. There are some programs, like I know public charter programs, that are required to give a grade, but even then, there's things we can do to diminish that. And so at the adolescent level, everything we do, all of our assessment, it's authentic assessment. So it's real work that they're doing across the environment. And that's how we as guides look and say, okay, what kinds of things are the students doing? What skills are they demonstrating? What concepts do they seem to be understanding through that work? So we're not giving a test. I'm not assigning a canned essay prompt. Students are writing advertisements for their microeconomy funds, or they're writing a paper based on something that they were really interested in seminar and they want to explore it further. Those are the kinds of things that we're looking for that come out of the students' interests. And then when we talk about evaluation, I think what's really important for us guides is to be aware of the external standards and then to be able to communicate what that is to the student and what those are to parents without putting really any emphasis on them at all. So I had an experience when I first became an adolescent guide, and I was told, you must demonstrate that what you're doing is connected to the Common Core State Standard because that's what we as a school use as our benchmark. And so if you go look at the Common Core State Standards for 7th grade, there are nearly 70 standards. And upon first glance, you might say, oh my gosh, how could I ever cover all of those in a year? Right? But when you actually look at them, you see they're so minute and so specific so as to only be measurable by a standardized exam. Because of course, the reason we have the Common Core State Standards is because the education monopoly got together and said, how can we solidify our hold on the curriculum and testing market? And that's what you have today. So when you actually look at those nearly 70 standards, you can distill them down to about 10 that actually relate to language development in the environment that can be assessed authentically by work students are doing. And then when you've got that list, and when I had that list and I started to observe, I started seeing those things everywhere. And I realized everything we're doing is connected to these outside standards that, I have to then show that we're doing. And it became really easy to say, yes, we are meeting these standards A1, but A2, that's the lowest common denominator. And every time I would do an audit of authentic student work, I would be blown away by not just by one student or two students, but across the board. Now, the work that students were doing was leaps and bounds more impressive than when I had taught in a traditional program, precisely because my focus wasn't academics, because my focus was human development. And even when we have conversations with parents, so I know what a lot of schools will do is they'll use a mastery scale. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, or, not developing, proficient, mastered. Well, I hate to break it to you, but that's just a grade with different language. And Alfie Kohn writes about that in the intro to the book Ungraded by Susan Bloom. And if you folks haven't read it, I highly recommend it. But I've had conversations with parents where they'll come in and they'll say, well, why did my son get a developing and not a progressing? And that's the same problem as a grade, is we're not actually talking about the work the student has done. And so every time I have those conversations with parents, I say, let's not talk about the letter. Let's look at the student's work. Let's take out their portfolio. Let's look at the growth. So look at this thing the student wrote in September, and this thing they wrote in October, and this thing they wrote in November. This is the growth that I've seen. These are the areas for improvement. Take a look at this science lab they did. Take a look at this other piece here. And that we always need to shift the focus back to the work. So, whatever we as adults have to do to report out, whatever we have to do to make sure that our students get accepted to the next step, we should do. But we shouldn't let that change what we're doing internally. And we should always make sure that even when we're having those external conversations, we're bringing it back to the work. We're talking about the student's holistic growth, and we're always contextualizing what we see. So if a student gets an exam score that is excellent, that's great. Let's still talk about their portfolio and look at evidence for that in their work. If a student gets an exam score that's not so great, let's look at their portfolio and contextualize the work that they've done. And that's really the key, I think, is that because we're holistic, because we're observing, because we have all these artifacts for authentic assessment, we as Montessorians have such a better grasp of what students can do and where they are. And we just have to make sure we communicate that to a world that, as of yet, still doesn't really value it the way that they should.